In Magic the Gathering, the Storm Scale is an unofficial system used by head designer Mark Rosewater when talking about the likelihood of a mechanic appearing in a standard legal set. While power is certainly a big consideration, there are other factors. Popularity, design space, versatility, development challenges, and playability challenges are other things taken into consideration on whether or not a mechanic will appear in standard. The scale assigns mechanics a numerical value from 1 through 10, with a 1 being an absolutely, this is probably being printed in the next standard set, or evergreen mechanics, to a 10, which is an absolutely not, this is almost never coming back to standard again without a major miracle. But what are the mechanics doomed to a level 10? And what did they do to deserve such a fate? Today, let's take a look at all 16 mechanics that are a level 10 on the Storm Scale. Now, before we get into things, I want to make something really clear. Not every single mechanic has been put on the Storm Scale yet. Mark Rosewater has been doing articles about different sets and their mechanics and where they are on the Storm Scale over the years, but he has not always done those. So a lot of older mechanics don't even get put on the Storm Scale until somebody asks him on his blog. We're kicking things off with the mechanic that named the entire system Storm. Whenever you cast a spell with Storm, copy it for each other spell cast before it that turn. The problem with Storm is it completely warps formats around it. Storm doesn't care if the spell's before it resolved, or even who cast them. And because Storm is a cast trigger in and of itself, the majority of standard legal and standard safe counter magic cannot deal with it. Plus, proactive Storm cards warp any cheap spells or rituals that play design might want to put into a set. In terms of playability, Storm both forces players to keep track of Storm count, or how many spells have been cast, but sometimes floating mana if going for a combo kill. If the right tools are in place, Storm quickly becomes this hard to interact with combo deck in standard, and even if the counter magic is able to keep up, completely warps the meta around either being Storm or having blue to try and beat Storm. Poisonous gives a player X amount of poison counters when a creature with Poisonous deals combat damage to them. There are only 2 cards that have this effect, Snake Cult Initiation and Virulent Sliver. If you've played Standard recently, that explanation sounds awfully familiar. Poisonous at one point used to be a 7 on the Storm Scale, probably due to the challenges of balancing poison counters, a mechanic that effectively halves your opponent's life total, but with the recent printing of Toxic, it has been fundamentally replaced, so Poisonous has gone from a 7 all the way up to a 10. If design ever wants to use Poisonous, it's going to use Toxic instead. Gotcha is an unset mechanic that triggers when an opponent does or says something that returns the card with Gotcha from the graveyard to its owner's hand. And now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, hold on. Storm Scale is used for standard legal sets. This is an unset mechanic, so it's never going to be legal in standard. Well, Gotcha is a little bit of an exception because it's a Storm Scale card that's a Storm Scale 10 for unsets. So why? What about it makes it a Storm Scale 10? Well, let's think about how this mechanic actually plays out. It's a mechanic that triggers when your opponent does things like flick their cards, put their hand on the table, laugh, or say common phrases like deal damage. Not only does it punish players for doing things that Magic players typically do in games, the counterplay to this is to just sit there and do nothing. Turns out, the way to be considered a mistake in a joke set is to take all the fun out of it. Voting is a mechanic that has each player in the game voting on a decision. This can be between 2 different choices, permanents on the field, and even players. After the votes are tallied, a decision is made based on the results. The biggest issue with voting is it is not designed for 1v1 formats in mind, and the majority of voting effects trigger if it gets the most votes or is tied for the most votes. So for cards like Council's Judgment, you're going to want to vote for whatever permanent you think your opponent is going to vote for, because if you don't and you vote for something different, well, Both of them are tied for the most votes, so both permanents will be exiled. This means that voting doesn't really work at all in 1v1 and puts a lot of unnecessary complexity when it's just not needed. Go democracy. Alright, buckle up. This one's a doozy. So from 4th edition to 6th edition, play design was trying to simplify certain parts of the game. One of these is what we now know as the end phase. In Mirage, the end phase was a discard phase followed up by a cleanup phase. During this time, effects that ended at end of turn and creatures' power and toughness being reset happened at the same time in the cleanup phase. This mattered for certain cards like Armor of Thorns, with the idea being that you could flash it in, protect a creature, and then during the cleanup phase, it would sacrifice itself and the creature's power and toughness would be reset. So you would be saving the creature from lethal damage until 6th edition, which introduced the current turn structure. Now we have our end phase, which is separated into the end step and a cleanup phase. All effects that happen at end of turn, like Armor of Thorns, they triggered in the end step, but damage being removed still happened at the cleanup step. So now with Armor of Thorns, it falls off before the damage is removed. So a creature equipped with it would die because it's taken lethal damage, so the effect didn't work as intended anymore. So what do we do about this? Well, we add this little invisible mechanic called Substance, which effectively pushed these at end of turn effects forward, and then Substance removed itself after end step had been passed, and then Substance would be gone, and then its sacrifice effect would trigger. This stuck around until the 2010 rules changes, where Substance was removed and the Substance effect was just eroded in and written on the cards that needed it. After this, Substance was never really seen again, and with our current turn structure not really changing, it's very unlikely we will ever see it again. Just a quick side note, if you've been enjoying the video so far, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Liking the videos shows me that you like this type of video, so I'll make more of this style, and subscribing to the channel means you can stay up to date with any new videos that come out, and I'd appreciate it a lot. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. Back to the video. -0, -1 counters are exactly what they sound like. They're a counter that gives a creature -0, -1. Go figure. Mark Rosewater hasn't said a lot about this type of counter, but I have a couple of guesses as to why they're a Storm level 10. Let's compare -0, -1 counters to -1, -1 counters. -1, -1 counters affect both the power and toughness of a creature, weakening them in both ways and putting in a player's mind that they are in fact fully weakening the creature, whereas a -0, -1 counter only reduces the toughness, which, yeah, it dies to more things, but it can still attack just as well, and in players' minds, that doesn't really feel like weakening a creature so much. Because of the immense popularity of -1, -1 counters, I really don't see -0, -1 or any other weird variations of it to appear anytime soon. Regenerate stops a permanent from being destroyed, instead removing all damage from it, removing it from combat at the cost of tapping it. Fun fact, Regenerate used to be an evergreen mechanic, so a 1 on the Storm scale. But here's the problem with Regenerate. It is incredibly complex for new players. Trying to navigate how it exactly works, what happens if you try to regenerate more than once, if it hits the graveyard first, when regenerate happens. To players more familiar, this wasn't so bad, but an evergreen mechanic just can't have this many questions from new players. Over time, Indestructible also just became more popular and easier to use, and Regenerate was mostly replaced with tap and give this creature indestructible until end of turn. Artifact lands are lands with the artifact type. Go figure. While this might seem innocuous, anyone who played Standard while these were legal knows that that is not the case. These are an incredibly problematic design for Standard, which led to all of them being banned at once the last time they were legal. When these are legal, a balancing act happens behind the scenes because you simultaneously need them in a set that cares about artifacts, otherwise what's the point of printing them, but at the same time you can't have artifact payoffs that are too good or suddenly the entire meta will warp around the lands being extremely good for that. So the balance is basically impossible from a design perspective to get right. Because of this, it hasn't been tried since the first banning and probably won't be tried ever again. Slivers are a creature type with abilities that buff other slivers. This can be through stats, giving keywords, or giving different effects entirely. Older slivers gave these effects symmetrically. Whenever slivers have been playable, people play slivers. Profound statement, I know. And because of this, tracking becomes an absolute nightmare in mirror matches. Both players' fields are affected by each other, and remember, the sliver buffs range from stat changes to keywords or entirely new effects. Not to mention that if a sliver is destroyed, every single sliver on the field now has to update its game state. This just made for miserable games that slowed to a crawl in mirror matches. Nowadays, design prefers slivers that only buff your slivers to prevent this from happening again, and it's very unlikely that they will ever return to symmetrical slivers. Partner commanders are commanders that allow you to have another commander if both have partner. So I'm gonna get this out of the way immediately. Mark Rosewater has already said that partner is a storm scale 10 because it's a scale for Standard and partner just does not work outside of commander. The effect does literally nothing. And because of that, it's always going to be a 10. Now, partner with, or partners with, is a 9 on the storm scale, so there is a chance for that mechanic to see play in Standard, but realistically, this mechanic, for Standard purposes, partners is always going to be a 10. Mark Rosewater put it on the storm scale because he was asked about it. Cumulative Upkeep is an effect that at the beginning of your upkeep puts an age counter on the permanent with the effect, and then you have to pay the cumulative upkeep cost multiplied by the amount of age counters on it. Paying mana or paying life are the two most common costs. The big issue with it is complexity and popularity. First, making sure to always uptick a counter and then do an effect reliant on the amount was a little tedious. Because the cost has to be paid every turn and is multiplied, it quickly gets out of hand, with permanents usually not lasting for more than 2 to 3 turns. Because of this, you need these cards to be powerful so that players can get their effects out of it, but you also have to balance for those cases where the players keep sinking the cost into it. And let's be honest, the mechanic just isn't fun. Having to pay a tax just to keep a card around, with the tax becoming larger every single turn, just isn't a fun gameplay loop, and I think it's the main factor contributing to Cumulative Upkeep not returning. Chroma is a mechanic that gives an effect based on the amount of same color mana symbols, usually among permanents you control, but sometimes based on other things. Man, doesn't this mechanic sound familiar? For a time, Chroma bounced around a 5 or a 6 on the storm scale. It was really helpful and a useful tool for monocolored design, but it wasn't exactly a catch-all mechanic that went into everything. Then, Theros came out and Devotion was printed. And after that, Chroma went from a 5 or a 6 right to a 10. Theros proved itself to be a tweaked, improved, and overall more flavorful version of Chroma, and design has never looked back. If they ever want to use Chroma, they are just going to use Devotion. Slith Matter cards care about players running Sliths, a creature type with 8 total creatures, and they only have one real effect shared amongst themselves, which is when they deal combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on them. Sliths have never gotten any cards that buff them specifically, and also of those 8 creatures I mentioned, 2 of them were just recently printed in Modern Horizons 3. These creatures are highly unlikely to ever return to Standard, so they're never gonna really warrant Slith Matters cards, and it's only on the Storm scale because Mark Rosewater was asked about it on his blog. Oh god, can I just read my notes for this one? I'm just gonna read my notes for this one. Banding allows a creature with banding and a creature without to attack together. Both creatures have to be blocked as if they were one creature attacking, and instead of your opponent deciding where their blocking creature's damage goes, you get to decide instead. That is the simplest explanation of banding that gets most of the details correct. If you couldn't guess, the issue with banding is its complexity. It completely overwrites how combat is supposed to work in Magic the Gathering, and while at a simple level it mostly works as intended, the second you throw other factors in like keywords, bans attacking into bans, etc., everything just creates a needless amount of rules complexity and a ton of judge questions. Overall, a very miserable mechanic that is just best left to rot. But there's another version of banding that deserves to rot just a little more. Alright, take banding, we just talked about it, fresh in your mind, great, good. Bands with other is a way to allow banding with more than one creature, and because of that they gave it a restriction. Now, there is one creature, Master of the Hunt, that creates tokens that just band with themselves. That's great, but the other 5 cards that do this outside of an unset are lands, and each of them has the same text on them. They give certain color of legends bands with other legends. Okay, so in your mind, let's say it's the red one. Red legends gain bands with other legends. Makes sense. They can band with other legendary creatures, except that's not how it works, because bands with other only works if all of the creatures trying to band together have the entire effect. So in order to band with legends, you have to already have bands with legends, but those lands only apply it to legends of the certain color. So arbitrarily, if you had the red one out and you had Magda and Kethis, it reads like Magda and Kethis should be able to band together with it. But because Kethis isn't red, so he doesn't have the bands with other legends effect, they actually can't band together. Doesn't that make sense? Reading the card explains the card. But don't worry, they added an errata to change this in the 2010 rules change. So as you can see, bands with other, just like banding, creates needlessly complex situations, and the effect didn't even work correctly as written because of hidden rules inside the effect for like a decade. And last but not least, we have Ante. Ante was technically a different way of playing the game that utilized something called an ante zone. At the beginning of the game, each player would pick a random card from their library and put it into the ante zone. If you've seen old Yu-Gi-Oh, you kind of know where this is going. The winner of that game would get all the cards in the ante zone. They were now theirs. Wow, gambling. Yippee! This was considered not fun by the player base, if you could imagine. And my gambling joke before, well, that was a legitimate concern, because if Ante was seen as legitimate gambling, suddenly venues would be forced to have gambling licenses, and people under 21 might not even be able to play in official tournaments. So because of these two issues, both the player base absolutely hating Ante and the actual gambling violations that could be cropping up, Wizards of the Coast decided to just axe Ante. It's now an unofficial way to play the game, and every card with Ante on it is banned on the vintage ban list. Because of this, Ante got brought down to a 9 in 2016? Outrage and shock aside, this was probably because Mark Rosewater was answering a question that put Ante with a bunch of other effects that aren't just actual gambling violations, and he saw the majority of them as 9s and just kind of brushed over Ante because it was a weird outlier. Ever since that post, he has always referred to Ante as a 10 on the Storm scale, and unless Wizards is getting into the gambling industry, I really don't see this changing any time soon. And with that, we've covered every single mechanic that is a 10 on the Storm scale. I'm sure this list will grow in the future, but for now, I'm pretty happy with the mechanics that are on the list. From needlessly complex to functionally replaced to violating gambling laws, there is a myriad of reasons that mechanics are on this list. And I think Storm Scale 10, as well as just the Storm Scale in general, is a really interesting way of looking at design. What works, what doesn't, what used to work but doesn't anymore. It's just a very fascinating way of looking at a game. But until next time, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.